Hi, and welcome to Module 14, where we'll be discussing realism and photography. So today's lecture is fairly straightforward in terms of what we're covering. We'll talk about realism, the development of this style in the middle of the 19th century. We'll also talk about developments in the medium of photography, which also is invented as we sort of know it today in the middle of the 19th century. And then we'll discuss one example of modern architecture. So the emphasis today is on the developments of the modern world. So you'll be hearing that word from me quite regularly today, modern. So I want to start with this map showing the industrialization of Europe. And this is what's really taking place around 1850. You can see the differences around Europe and how developed these things are, especially in terms of industrialization, the rise of factories and other methods of quicker production. So you can see that it all really began in the United Kingdom, in England, and then it spreads to France and Germany and Switzerland in particular, as well as the Netherlands, and then it spreads to the eastern part of Europe and further south later on in the 1800s. And you see the little white areas are where the industrialization is occurring even more strongly than in the rest of the country around it. So modernism is this slippery concept we'll be dealing with from this point onwards. It develops during the 19th century in art and society, and it becomes closely entwined with the political, intellectual, and economic circumstances of this period. The art of the 19th century and the development of modernism entailed a questioning of the canon by artists, that is, which are the most important works, and they began questioning art and its role in general. So they questioned the role of art and the responsibility of the artist, as well as academic standards of what constituted art. Now, I've mentioned this academy a couple of times, especially in relationship to France, but other countries had them too. By the mid-19th century, the academies had become very formulaic and standardized, and it was the primary means of artistic training and success. They would hold these exhibitions called salons, and they were the major cultural artistic event, and in Paris they were even government sponsored. But artists began questioning and challenging traditional art materials as well. We see a new interest in this period in exploring and exploiting the material quality of art. We see a decisive break in the middle of the 19th century with illusionistic or imaginative art. It's a movement away from classicism and romanticism as well. There's a different interest in responding to contemporary events. Artists begin to depict subjects that were part of and represented contemporary cultural experience, so an even greater interest in the world around them. Modernism in art was in part a response to the incredible changes occurring in the socio-economic, intellectual, and political spheres of 19th century Europe and the United States. In the second half of the 1800s, you see this period of great growth of industry, urbanization, and the development of globalization. There's the development of machines, the textile industry, steel, and electricity all come about during this time. There was also a great increase in and development of means of communication and transportation. Transportation in particular was facilitated by the development of steam-operated engines for trains and ships, making travel faster. And Europe and the United States experienced large-scale construction of railways, making getting around much faster than it ever had been. With communication, the telephone and radio are invented during this period as well. This profoundly affects the state of living of Europeans and Americans and lends a new accessibility of the world. Cities also really begin to explode in population and development during this time. Industrialization causes a rise of factory production. Farmers are forced to give up their land and move to the city to work in factories, and often this was under rather squalid conditions. We also see in this period a sort of social democratization. That is, people of all walks of life are now thrown together into the same environment. And there's lots of class tension, something that we saw in particular in France during the two French revolutions, the one in the late 18th century, and then again there's a revolution of 1848, which is a revolt of the peasant class. This is also a time of great advancement in science. The Enlightenment and rationalism of the 18th century are reinforced by 19th century industrial developments. The notion of science is an indication of progress. Science now is based on empirical observation, Everything was approached and analyzed from careful observation without any metaphysical preconception. In this period, you also have the rise of what's called Positivism with Auguste Comte, who was a French philosopher advocating a purely scientific and empirical approach to nature and society. And this is also the period where Charles Darwin begins publishing, especially his theory of evolution and survival of the fittest. So lots and lots of different sorts of development in the socio-political realm. So the first movement we're going to talk about today is called Realism, and this can be characterized as the painting of modern life. It's a movement that develops in France in the mid-19th century, and it's a reaction against Romanticism and Neoclassicism that dominated in the first half of the 19th century. They thought that the Romantics were too imaginative or too illusionistic. This is not to be confused, this notion of realism is not to be confused with our discussion of naturalism that we've talked about as an aspect of the Baroque and in Renaissance art. Here, realism is a conscious artistic movement that is based on empirical observation, temporal and visual accuracy, and it entails a democracy of subject, so everything can be represented on a monumental scale: ordinary people, places and things, historical and mundane events, and typically this is without a moralizing or overtly spiritual theme. It's quite a complex movement, and it occurs in France, England, and America, among others. And it's a philosophical, scientific, and artistic movement. But of course, in this class, we're focusing on the artistic aspect of it. Some of the important literary figures, though, who are publishing in this realist vein include Gustave Flaubert, Émile Zola, Champfleury, and many of these men had close friendships with their artistic counterparts. So we're going to focus on subjects that are derived from everyday contemporary life. There's no fictional or religious subjects here. It's a conscious renouncement of what came before and what was approved by the Academy. So we'll start with this work by Gustave Courbet, and it's called The Stonebreakers, and it dates to 1849. Now, most people will say that it was destroyed in World War II. It was in a museum in Germany. But it's thought more nowadays that there's probably a lot of these artworks presumed destroyed that actually survive. And things appear all the time, especially out of Russia. It's a completely different discussion to have, though. Courbet is the artist most readily associated with realism in France. He was born in 1819 in a rural town outside of Paris, a fact which would inform many of the images he created. He was the first to define his work as realist in 1855 at a self-titled show he held outside of the main Paris salon called the Pavilion of Realism. It's significant in that it represented not only his self-conscious association with realism, but also his challenging of the artistic tradition of the Academy. Many of his works have been refused from the salon of that year. So the Academy, they set the standards in the art world. The major role of the Academy is to educate artists once they're accepted into it, but also to exhibit their works, and they were the arbiter of taste. So if your work is rejected, you're not accepted by the standard ideas of taste in that period, and Courbet is a good example of that. The Stonebreakers is one of his most famous works. In subject, in manner of representation, the scale, and the technique, it's all characteristic of French realism. The subject here is the peasant class. These stonebreakers, they're the people who were responsible for preparing the roads in France. It's a very difficult job. So you know that show that is on the Discovery Channel called Dirty Jobs? This was absolutely one of the worst jobs to have, and this would be a perfect subject for that show. What they're doing is they're breaking up these large stones into small pieces of gravel. It's back-breaking work. Only the lowest classes would do it, and it's something that shows a sharp divide with the upper classes, in fact. So this is depicting what was actually occurring in mid-19th century France. So because of urbanization, there was a lot of construction of new roads into Paris. The workers here are rural. They could not maintain life as farmers because of the industrialization of the cities. And this is what their state of life is reduced to because of urbanization and so-called progress. Courbet is scrupulous in representing the details of this scene. It's not idealized. It's not moralizing, the figures are not heroic, and it's not nostalgic at all. It shows in a matter-of-fact way the harsh reality of life. You can see the landscape in the background is not lush, it's mostly very stony. It's not welcoming. With the two figures, we see this man and a child both struggling with the chore. Notice Courbet does not show their faces, so there's an aspect of sympathy to them, but you're not meant to identify with them, and that's one of the reasons he's hiding their face. Notice he's emphasizing, instead of their faces, their rugged clothing. You can see how both of their pairs of pants have been patched many times. Their shirts are ripped. Their shoes are heavy, and they're in no way heroic, and no aspect of them is heroic. But he does this on a monumental scale. So in this way, it's a way of sort of challenging the Academy. It's over 5 feet by 8 feet high, and this was a size typically reserved for history paintings or another lofty subject, which the Academy promoted. So think back to Géricault's Raft of the Medusa or Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. This is on a scale with that, but the subject is so incredibly different. In his technique, there's a sort of gritty reality to the scene. This is emphasized by the textural effect of the painting. Courbet would often use a palette knife to apply paint in these large patches of color, which leaves an effect called impasto, where there's a thick buildup of paint on the surface. So there's an actual texture to the painting if you were to run your hand over it. It's not perfectly smooth like somebody like Caravaggio. That's in sharp contrast also with the smooth surfaces preferred by the Academy. These aspects of his work were seen as highly problematic, if not outright outrageous, to contemporary viewers. I mentioned already this revolution of 1848, so remember that's taking place just a year before this painting is done. And again, this was this peasant class revolt in France and other countries for workers' rights. It was completely squashed by the bourgeois class, who were the intended audience of paintings by Courbet and others. So Courbet is sort of presenting to the major audience of viewers, the bourgeois class, this aspect of life that they try to hide from themselves. Courbet was in effect putting this event and labor and class issues in front and center again for French viewers, which of course they did not react well to. Remember, this was originally intended for the Salon, but did not make it in. But his paintings were not really meant as a political message. He was just representing the realities of life in and around Paris during this time. There's something of a challenging aspect to this work, both in terms of how it speaks to the viewer and its relationship to the artistic canon. And this is one of these hallmarks of the notion of modernism. It starts to challenge the viewer in new ways and challenge what is expected of art and artists. Another fantastic example of realism is the work of Jean-Francois Marais. And this painting is called The Gleaners, and it dates to 1857. He, like Courbet, displayed a similar interest in painting people and subjects from everyday life. Technically, he can be considered in a separate school of painting besides realism, and that is something called the Barbizon school. This was a group of painters who specialized in landscapes and scenes from the Forest of Fontainebleau, which was a palace and a community outside of Paris. Millet is the most famous of the Barbizon school, but he's unusual of that group of painters in his focus on scenes of peasant life rather than in pure landscape. So the subject we're seeing here are 3 peasant women who are doing something called gleaning after the harvest has been taken in. Gleaning was this traditional feudal rite. So in feudalism, the serfs were the lowest classes who worked the land. So this process of gleaning was allowing peasants to sift through the harvested land for scraps of grains and hay to take home. So in the background, you can see the piles of hay. You can see this cart in the background surrounded by a couple of figures here. And this is all showing the result of the harvest. Millet indicates that, and you can see some buildings in the background to show a setting and where this is taking place. But he's making monumental these 3 peasant figures who are doing this act of gleaning. It's a very painstaking and tedious task. There's not much left after the harvest, and it took a very long time for not much reward at all. So he's similar to Courbet in his interest in depicting lower classes performing a mundane and everyday chore, much like the Stonebreakers. It's unidealized. It's got this harsh reality being portrayed. Also, like Courbet, notice that he mostly hides the face of these figures. Instead of focusing on an individual aspect to them, they're sort of generic types. And he emphasizes even more that bending over and the reaching down and the back-breaking process of gleaning. He's got an interest in materiality in his paints. Like Courbet, he's interested in that texture rather than in a smoothly finished surface. But he's also different from Courbet in that he's a bit more sentimental and heroicizing. The figures are quite large and in front of a vast landscape. It speaks here more to urbanization issues as well. As I said, in the background, you can see this industrial farm. It's bathed in sunlight in the background, especially, emphasizing this idea of progress and booming industry. Whereas the foreground, the gleaners are under a bit more of a shadowy aspect, it's supposed to be a bit more nostalgic in this way, showing the end of an era, this end of these feudal rights. Because again, farming as this manual labor, of course, still existed to a certain extent, but that was being industrialized as well. This is a much smaller format, though, than Courbet, so it's not monumental in scale. This is only about 2 feet by 3 feet. Again, this was not well received by typical art viewers, and for the most part, the major audience for painting in Paris at this time was the bourgeois class, so quite the upper class, not quite aristocracy, but not middle class either. For the bourgeoisie, they were used to academic art that did not speak to the issues of the peasant classes. They were far more interested in seeing romantic landscapes and seeing mythological scenes, but not these scenes of peasant life. They didn't understand this. This was not present in their everyday life. Realism also occurs outside of France, including in the United States. And now I want to focus on one example of American realism. In the US, realism was particularly influential in the second half of the 19th century. There's a few key figures, including Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins. Some of the major centers for realism in the US were Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia Museum of Art has a fantastic collection of American realism. One of the centerpieces of the Philadelphia Art Museum collection is this painting called the Grouse Clinic, although it spends half the year at PAFA, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So in the US, in the second half of the 19th century, artists are seeking to find a new American style that could compete with the artistic centers in Europe, especially Paris. So I mentioned this before, but artistic capitals move around. And before we talked about Italy as a major center of art, then it moves to Paris in the later part of the 17th century, and it stays in Paris for a couple of hundred years. But there are a lot of artists working in the US and trying to find their own style. Many of them go to Europe to study and to display their works in the salons of Europe. They're keenly aware of what's going on there because of this travel that they did to Europe. So they're very aware of what's happening outside of the US. They felt this need to find a new, innovative style that was once American and modern. They thought that earlier types of American art, think of the Hudson River School and Thomas Cole, for example, they found that rather outdated. So one of the big proponents of trying to find this new style was Thomas Eakins. He was a realist painter of contemporary American genre scenes, and he also painted a number of portraits. And he was from Philadelphia. He's very much attached to our city. He was born and raised in what is now Center City, right around 13th and Chestnut is where he was born. He also did a lot of scenes out of Fairmount Park of rowers and swimmers and hunters in the local marsh areas, in addition to portraits of friends and family. His artistic training was a blend of European styles and what's called regionalism in the US, and he studied at PAFA, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He went to France for 3 years from 1866 until 1869, and he worked in the studio of a painter named Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was part of the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Beautiful Arts in Paris. He also traveled to Spain while he was in Europe. He came back to Philadelphia, and this is when he started to consciously find a way to blend his European training with local scenes, developing this idea of American realism. This painting, The Grouse Clinic, is one of his most famous works. It's his first large-scale painting and his first group portrait. It was a non-commissioned portrait of Dr. Samuel Grouse, who we see highlighted in the center. Grouse was a surgeon and teacher at the Jefferson Medical College, and at that point in time, he was the most renowned surgeon in America. Eakins wanted to show him as a modern figure and as a symbol of the modern in Philadelphia. What we're seeing here is Eakins performing a new surgery that he had developed for a bone infection called osteomyelitis. He's not performing an amputation of the limb, but instead he's just removing a part of the dead bone. Eakins is very careful with the attention to portraying the scene scientifically and temporally accurate. You see a man sitting in the back here who's holding this piece of fabric in his hand. We can imagine him as the anesthesiologist covering up the patient's face. Anesthesiology was only introduced in 1848. One other thing we notice is this lack of sterilization. You see their bare hands covered in blood. You see all sorts of hands in this person's body, opening it up, performing this surgery, and they're all dressed very nicely in their suits because this is how surgeons operated. This is all taking place in this lecture studio, a sort of surgical theater. You see all the figures in the background who are watching the event take place, and you've got this poor woman over here who is reacting to the grisly nature of this scene. Eakins does not shy away from showing the blood and the cut open body and the instruments being used here. All of the individuals that you can really make out in the foreground, all of them are portraits, and it includes Eakins himself in this painting. The setting is very accurate. That's another aspect of realism. This is how surgery lectures were conducted in this amphitheater. There's sunlight coming in because at this point they would have used mostly natural light to illuminate the scene. So you see the light coming in, falling on the patient where the surgery is being performed, but also very distinctly on the head of Dr. Grouse right here. Grouse has stopped in the middle of what he's doing in the middle of the surgery to explain what's going on to all the people. The perspective of the scene is very carefully constructed to make us feel as if we are in the amphitheater and present in this moment. But we're more like one of the figures down here at the bottom based on the vantage point we're receiving. Maybe we're like these figures in the doorway over here. So not really operating ourselves, but observing everything very closely. The realism is a bit harsh, and it was actually quite controversial when it debuted, with the blood all over the surgeon's hands, the woman in the background, the mother of the patient, recoiling in shock and despair at the surgery. This was, like a lot of the European realist works, rejected from an art exhibition at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. It was rejected because of this shocking realism. So, Eakins is trying to represent an actual event with real portraits, and he's painstaking in his detail without shying away from the grisly aspects of the scene. He emphasizes Grouse, Dr. Grouse here, as this teacher, as this enlightened figure who is the scientist but also the teacher. And again, the fact that the light is falling right on his head. You see that in Renaissance portraits as well, emphasizing the intellect of this central figure. Now I'd like to move on to another painter who is often considered a realist, but really Edouard Manet is doing his own thing. His work is quite distinct from other realists. At this point in the 1860s, as I've said, the Academy is still running the show. It's a very competitive institution. They would only support a limited range of subjects and techniques. There was a certain growing dissatisfaction on the part of artists who were continually rejected from these academic salons, these places where they displayed the paintings of contemporary artists. So in 1863, Napoleon III, the ruler of France at that point, established something called the Salon des Refusés, where all of the rejected works were exhibited. So this first work by Manet that we're talking about was among those in this exhibition. So I'm showing you what's referred to as Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe from 1863, and I'm giving you the French title. Most painting titles we translate into English, but some are so well known by their original titles that it's better to keep them in the original language. And this is one of those. So Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe means luncheon on the grass. Manet is considered to be a key artist for the development of modernism. Clement Greenberg, who is a very important 20th century American art critic, identified this painting as the first modernist painting, in that it overtly reaffirms the two-dimensional quality of the painted canvas, so it's really quite flat. Manet represents an important figure between two significant modernist movements, Realism and Impressionism. He ends up painting in both of these modes and displays his works alongside both of these groups of artists. He's influenced by realist literature, philosophy, and artists such as Gustave Courbet, but his painterly effects would be influential for Impressionist artists such as Claude Monet. As I said, he's different from other realist painters because Courbet, for example, focuses on the lower class and rural people, whereas Manet focuses entirely on urban culture and social realities. He also came from an upper-class Parisian background, which helps explain why his interest was in the urban center. He embodies what's called the flaneur, which was this upper-class dandy. Yet his paintings also challenge the same class that he was from, so he highlights these leisurely pursuits of the bourgeoisie, of this upper class. The subject that we see here is a very strange scene. We have two women, one of whom is entirely naked, with two fully dressed men at some sort of picnic in the park. The three front figures, we can identify all of them. The naked woman is named Victorine Morin, and she was a model he used for many of his paintings. The man on the right is his brother Eugene, and the man behind Victorine is the sculptor Ferdinand Leenhoff. The woman in the background, she's a little too fuzzy to make out and identify with a portrait. So it's this contemporary scene with contemporary recognizable figures. These portraits make it very current. The men are wearing contemporary Parisian attire. It's an identifiable Parisian park. And the figures are rather unidealized. The woman who is staring out at us, the only figure really looking at us, the man behind her can sort of be seen looking towards us, but he's not making any eye contact like she is. She is very explicitly naked rather than nude. You can see over in the bottom left of the painting her clothes and hat that have been cast off, along with this tumbled over fruit basket with bread on the ground. So they're not even really eating their luncheon on the grass. As I said, Manet is considered a very modern painter, but he is definitely reliant upon earlier models. So here I'm showing you a painting by an artist named Giorgione, who is the teacher of Titian. And this is a very similar subject to what Manet has chosen to show. So Manet, in his painting, is quoting these Renaissance sources. In fact, there's another print that's based on some Venetian paintings where the composition is almost identical to what Manet is doing, whereas here we just have the similar subject with the two women who are nude, notice I didn't say naked, and then two men who are clothed as they're enjoying the countryside. So even though he's looking to these older sources, Manet is really sort of challenging them in a way, making them modern. Notice the difference in the female figures, this eye contact with the viewer, the fact that her body is pale and not really idealized. It's flattened out with these large patches of pure color. She's not in any way coy or bashful. She's very straightforward, and this was quite shocking for contemporary viewers. But the references here to past art is also important for establishing Manet's role within this canon. So he's staking his own claim in the history of art by quoting these earlier paintings. He's advocating a new development in art, one that takes its place within the whole of art history. So there's just distinct awareness of the past. Manet continuously sought to be accepted by the traditional art institutions, these salons, and he was refused over and over for the most part. And your reading from today includes some of the ideas for how Manet felt about being rejected so regularly. So it's a little bit problematic for its subject matter and its manner of depiction. So these naked women this naked woman is in a park with two dressed men. It's sort of a commentary on prostitution, which was one of the pursuits of the bourgeois class. Also, the manner of depiction, this flat and loose brushwork, was seen as problematic as well. The landscape is very broadly painted. It's really more just a suggestion of a landscape, especially behind the woman who's wading in this pool. You just see these patches of almost pure color. It's not really illusionistic. It's not really trying to recreate a setting like it would look to the viewer. The figures in the foreground are also pretty harshly outlined, almost like Botticelli, which flattens out the space. The light in this scene, we see Manet exploring the properties of light as represented through the painted medium. And I want to say again that this is not a recreation of illusionistic space. It's more about how you can experiment with the pictorial properties of light. This painting was very harshly criticized and people just absolutely hated it. But I think Manet knew what he was doing, because this is something that I teach in every single art history class that covers this period. It's a work that cannot be excluded from the history of art in any way. The other painting I want to talk about by Manet is this called Olympia, dating from 2 years later, 1865. And here we see an even more blatant reference to the leisurely activities of contemporary bourgeois Parisian men. That is prostitution. The subject and style resulted in very harsh criticism, just like Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So the subject is an everyday prostitute. This name Olympia was a common name of prostitutes in this period. We see all of the accoutrements of her profession with her. Notice that she is again very naked rather than nude. We see her wearing this bracelet, this nice little ribbon necklace, and her shoes that she still has on here. She has an orchid in her hair. She looks like a real person. You can tell this is actually a portrait. You can get a sense of the model here. We see her attendant in the background here who is bringing flowers from a client. And there's very clear references to sexuality in the scene. Number one, she is very naked, lying on this bed. Number two, the cat was a major symbol of sexuality. But also, there are a lot of issues going on with race in this scene, because notice her attendant is of African descent, whereas Olympia is painted in these very broad white strokes. So there's all sorts of suggestions of this sexual energy and tension in this painting. Now, hopefully this reminds you of something we looked at before. That is Titian's Venus of Urbino. Notice that Manet is almost completely borrowing every aspect of this scene. So keep this in your memory while we look at Manet's painting. You have the same composition on the left-hand side, where there's this vertical element and a curtain being pulled back here. You've got the same reclining naked woman figure on a bed. The sheet is tucked into the mattress. Similarly, you see the brocade covering the mattress here. You can see the similarities, the flowers here. Instead of a dog, Manet has included a cat. We have less of a sense of background of this space, but again, an attendant, a servant of the central figure. So Manet again is showing that he knows his art history. But it's very different from his prototype. Olympia, unlike the Venus of Urbino, she is not flirtatious or amorous. She is directly staring out at the viewer. Now, this is a very bright painting. There's very minimal shade. It's not very three-dimensional. The background is very flat. Her body would not have been considered very beautiful. Look how flat it is. It's not really idealized. It's just sort of these planes of the body indicating the shapes of the figure. Also, her hand is quite different than that of the Venus of Urbino. Remember, hers could be interpreted as a sort of modest gesture, or perhaps not so modest. But here, the hand is just flat on her leg. Olympia is absolutely in control in this scene. She is a woman of business here. So this is a distinct reference to this bourgeois culture in 19th century Paris, with her looking directly at us, implying that we are her client. So there's this really strong emphasis here on the male gaze in the scene. The major intended viewer for any painting was a male. And so imagine if you are a 19th century French bourgeois male going to see this painting. It might be something you've actually seen in your life. So it would be rather uncomfortable for the male viewers of this work. She's really almost holding you hostage with that look, making that eye contact, and she doesn't have an inviting facial expression at all. So again, Manet reasserts this two-dimensional nature of a painted surface. It's very flat. There's little illusionism or chiaroscuro. The background is more shapes and patterns, and very painterly. There's very little blending to make it look like really distinct patterns. The curtain is just sort of abstracted almost. It really cuts us off. It's not a window into a different world or a world similar to our own. It's a flat painting. He reinforces the brushstroke and explores the formal qualities of paint. So Manet is a very important figure for the history of art. Now I want to talk about a couple of photographs, just to talk about the importance of this development in the middle of the 19th century. The development of photography, we can even say, was initiated by artists like Vermeer using the camera obscura to help them render subjects accurately. What's called the camera lucida, which is the opposite of a camera obscura in its meaning. So instead of dark room, camera lucida means lighted room. This was introduced in 1807, where a small prism lens was hung on a stand and projected the image of the object downward onto a sheet of paper. Eventually, in photography, two very different processes were announced nearly simultaneously in France and England. The Frenchman Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre and a British man named Talbot announced the first practical photographic process in 1839. It was a useful tool for recording the century's scientific discoveries. The patronage with something like photography shifted away from the elite toward a broader base of support. The middle class embraced the comprehensible images of the new medium and its lower cost than something like painting. Artists such as Delacroix, Courbet, and Degas, who we'll talk about in the next lecture, also embraced photography. They were intrigued by how photography transferred three-dimensional images to a two-dimensional surface. Other artists saw the new art as capable of displacing painting, so not everybody liked it, especially in the academy. So before 1839, another major development was done by another Frenchman named Niepce, who in 1826 was able to make a permanent picture of a cityscape inside a camera obscura. And the way that he's able to do this is by coating a metal plate with this light-sensitive material, but it required an 8-hour exposure. With what are called daguerreotypes, named after Daguerre, you've got the same idea with this chemically treated metal, but it doesn't take quite as long. They also developed a system of latent development in chemical solutions. So not only are they figuring out that light can be cast onto this chemically treated plate, but you can put it in certain solutions to help develop the image. So what I'm showing you here is one of the first successful plates after Daguerre had perfected his technique of photography. There's this interest after the development of the process to elevate photographs to the status of art. In this still life that we're seeing, it sort of should remind you of something like Vermeer, in that it's taking place in this corner of a room in an artist's studio, and we see this careful artistic arrangement of the objects within. And this also is seemingly inspired by Dutch Vanitas still lifes. So Daguerre has chosen a variety of objects and textures. Over on the left side, you see what looks almost like a classicizing relief sculpture. A couple of little putti figures. You see this woven basket in the background, offering another sort of texture. And then you've got this framed image up here, a curtain like we so often see in paintings. So he's carefully choosing what's being displayed here. And the photograph that we're looking at captures a wide array of lights and darks as well. It almost has this sort of chiaroscuro effect. So in choosing an arrangement for this still life, the objects are invested with a particular symbolic meaning since they cannot be manipulated after the photograph is taken. It's not like an oil painting that you can rework. This is a permanent image of something that was actually composed. I now want to talk about the photographer named Julia Margaret Cameron, and I'm showing you this image called Mrs. Herbert Duckworth, who was a common subject for Cameron, and this dates to 1867. Cameron was one of the most famous portrait photographers, and she was an English woman. She took up photography when she was 48, so after she'd been married for a while and had children. She did portraits of some of the most well-known figures in her period, including Charles Darwin, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Thomas Carlyle. The woman we're seeing here is actually the mother of Virginia Woolf, and at the time this photograph was taken, she was married to Herbert Duckworth. Her portrait styles have a slightly blurred focus that becomes her hallmark. She used a lens with a very short focal length, so only a small part of the work could be in a sharp focus, which adds a sort of dreamy atmosphere. In addition to portrait photography, she also did a number of photos of women dressed as literary characters. So in some ways, her works were sort of like paintings, the sort of basis in literature, but using this new medium to capture a similar thing as painting. Here is a fairly straightforward portrait. It's as if she was painted in light. She's emerging from this dark background. So again, the chiaroscuro effects are something that photographers are quite interested in. It has a sort of fragile quality, and there's this emphasis on a captured moment. Cameron thought that photography should capture the essence of the sitter. It's also interesting that she selected the profile view here. She did several portraits of Mrs. Herbert Duckworth. This isn't the only one. But here you've got this emphasis on the profile, much like a Roman coin or Renaissance portraits, for example. So remember I mentioned before the Mona Lisa, you have a lot of, for the most part, portraits of women are done in profile almost exclusively. There's this emphasis on the delicate lines of her face, the tendons in her neck. She's wearing this clothing that has this collar that frames her face in this way. So you can see Cameron emphasizing the face of the sitter. But notice she's not staring out at us. This profile view allows us to sort of gaze at her without her looking back at it. She's making her more the object of the work, not just the subject. So she's meant for viewing. So I want to talk about one example of modern architecture. Your book talks about a lot more. Unfortunately, we just don't have time. In the 19th century, we see a rise in scholarship and an interest in history, with nations becoming interested in their own past. This often manifests itself in architecture. The Industrial Revolution led to certain developments for architecture as well. So there's new materials that are employed to make buildings lighter and able to be built more quickly. What I'm showing you here is designed by the architect Joseph Paxton, and it's called the Crystal Palace. It was built in London and stood there from 1850 to 1851. It no longer stands today. One of the most important developments of the 19th century was cast iron construction. Iron and later steel, starting in the 1860s, allowed for engineering advancements and led to larger and stronger structures. The tensile strength of these materials meant that vast open spaces could be constructed. What I'm showing you here, the Crystal Palace, was the winning design for the Central Pavilion in the 1851 Great Exhibition in London. And this building was meant to present works of industry of all nations. So it's a giant exhibition hall. The whole structure was made with prefabricated parts, so it was erected very quickly and dismantled after the exhibition. It was re-erected outside of London afterwards because it was so well liked. So here we're seeing a building composed almost exclusively of iron and glass. And you can see in this image this interest in exposed materials. So Paxton is not trying to hide the supporting elements. He's not trying to put it under plaster or marble or stonework like they might have done before this. There's this interest in what it's actually made out of. The Crystal Palace actually borrowed from Basilica architecture with its huge flat roofs and a barrel vaulted transept. So even though it's using these brand new materials, innovative, brand new modern materials, showing this interest in displaying the materials even, architecture is always looking to the past, to the basilica plan, to large open work spaces, and even formats that we've seen since ancient Rome with this barrel vault system. So even in the 19th century, they're always looking to the past, even with the use of new materials, exploiting these new materials to create even larger open spaces than the Romans or the Renaissance was able to achieve. So after it was re-erected outside of London, it eventually was destroyed by fire in 1936. So now all we have are images of this building rather than the building itself. But this is a good representative of modern architecture of the 19th century. But again, as I said, your book talks about more than just this, so have a look there. So we went through a lot of material today. We started with realism, looking at the works of Courbet and Millet, and we also talked about the work of Thomas Eakins in the United States. We also discussed the innovations of Edouard Manet, who was coming out of realism and who became very influential to the later Impressionists, who are the subject of our next module. We also talked about the development of photography, and again, this will be important for later modules, both to the Impressionists, but also looking at later photographs as art objects. And finally, I concluded with the Crystal Palace, talking about some of the new developments in architecture. So now to finish Module 14, there is the self-assessment as always. You'll find a discussion board prompt as well as journal entry number 7 in the module. And finally, the vocabulary wiki is the responsibility of Group 1. So thank you for listening, and I will see you next time to talk about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism.